Oh, great. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of Modern Meadow, and I'm here to talk to you about some of my experiences in bio-entrepreneurship, and because this is a technical gathering, and I've been told that this is a group of very smart, tech-minded people, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background and an overview on biofabrication, which is some of my past adventures in entrepreneurship have been around this core theme of biofabrication. So I'll give you an overview of what that means and how we've been practicing it in the past. So what I'd like to cover is what is biofabrication. An example of biofabrication is bioprinting. So some of you might have heard about bioprinting. And then what really is bioprinting? How does it compare to 3D printing? It's sometimes uttered in the same breath. What are some of the similarities and differences? And then I'll talk about some of my adventures in entrepreneurship and how we've applied these principles of bioprinting or biofabrication in some opportunities both in medical applications and in consumer applications. And then I'll finish off by pontificating about some of the lessons learned in bio-entrepreneurship and how that might be different or similar to experiences in tech, more traditional tech entrepreneurship. Okay, so biofabrication is a very broad toolkit. It's basically almost anything you can create using cells or molecules or the stuff that cells produce. So it's it's not just a creation of molecules, but it's also the creation of cellular products and tissue products. And what's interesting about biofabrication is almost what does it not include? Almost anything you do with biology can be called biofabrication. It's a very, very broad toolkit. And there's additive forms of biofabrication. So bioprinting is one example of biofabrication. But then there's other things you can do with biofabrication as well. You can mold things. You can create sheets. Fermentation is a form of biofabrication if you think about it. So I like to think of biofabrication as an incredibly broad toolkit. And one example of this is bioprinting. So I've founded two companies. I co-founded two companies. The first company I co-founded is a company called Organovo, which is recognized for pioneering and commercializing bioprinting, which is a form of biofabrication. And the focus of Organovo is to create human tissue models using bioprinting that can be used to test and develop new drugs. And eventually, in the fullness of time, this technology could also be used to create human tissues that can serve a therapeutic purpose as well, potentially by having little patches of kidney, liver, heart tissue that could be implanted into patients. But for the time being, it's used as a platform for the acceleration of drug testing and drug development. Organovo's core technology is 3D bioprinting. And that is one important step, but it's not the end-all be-all. There's a lot of things leading up to bioprinting, and there's a lot of things downstream from bioprinting. So I'll give some insight into that as well. And Organovo was founded back in 2007. It's now a public company, and it's based in San Diego. It's got about 70 or so employees. I should say that because it's a public company, blah, 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 safe harbor. So I'm no longer a representative of the company, and I'm not going to disclose any public information about it, so you should interpret everything I say right now as a matter of public record. I don't have any insider information, so that's the confines of what I can talk about. And then I also co-founded Modern Meadow more recently, back in 2011. And Modern Meadow has a very different focus. So while Organovo is focused on medical applications and medical research applications, Modern Meadow is focused on creating animal products like meat and leather and potentially other products that are better and that don't involve killing animals or necessarily having the same harmful impact on the environment. So that's the focus of Modern Meadow. Very different focus from Organovo. And the toolkit of Modern Meadow is a broader one. So it involves more of the tools of biofabrication. It's a bit more agnostic. And we're doing a lot with cell culture and up from that. And it was founded in 2011, and last year we made the move to Brooklyn. So the company was established initially in Missouri and also in the Bay Area for the first 2 years of our operations. And then we decided last year to make the big move to Brooklyn. So we're delighted to be here. And what did I just do? There we go. So a little bit about bioprinting. So what is bioprinting? Bioprinting is analogous to 3D printing, except for in 3D printing, where you deposit layer by layer a material like a plastic, a resin, or metal, or some other material, and you deposit it layer by layer. Here, your building blocks are cell aggregates. So you're depositing cell aggregates layer by layer. And unlike traditional 3D printing, you also need to be very sensitive to the negative space. So you're depositing the cell aggregates surrounded by a cell inert material, typically a hydrogel. And what that does is the cell inert material, the hydrogel, holds the cells in place, the cell aggregates in place, long enough for certain biophysical forces to take their course. So cell aggregates will then merge together, fuse together, and cells will sort out. And that is very important because while bioprinting has certain similarities to 3D printing, it's not the same as 3D printing in the sense that it's not just enough to hit print and you have the deposition of the material and then really you're largely done. It's what happens post-printing that matures the tissue into something that is biologically fully active. So you might think of it as what a bioprinter can do is it can put cells into a state that is the embryonic precursor to the fully formed tissue. And then the morphogenetic processes of embryonic development take their course and mature that tissue into something that is more functional biologically. So in that sense, the fourth dimension of time is very important. And some of you may be familiar with this concept of 4D printing, which has been talked about, where you can 3D print something that self-organizes afterwards to become something else. Well, life is the ultimate self-organizing material. And that's the principle that bioprinting exploits, that you're creating a pattern that you then know how it can self-organize to become what you want it to become. And so it's not just the bioprinting, it's what happens after that, the conditioning that happens after that that creates your product. And bioprinting has a great degree of versatility. So you can make a whole bunch of structures that can replicate a native biological structure. This is what a bioprinter looks like in action. So this is Organovo's bioprinter, their NovoGen MMX printer. This is already an older model, one that they had developed several years ago. But you can see it's got basically two printer heads, one printer head that dispenses the cell aggregates. And by the way, the cell aggregates don't need to be one type of cell. They can be a mixture of cells. And the cells will find a way to sort themselves out under the right conditions. And then the other head dispenses the hydrogel, which is a cell inert scaffolding material that holds the shape of the cell aggregates together long enough for the tissue for the cell aggregates to fuse together. Moving on. So this is to reinforce that point, that bioprinting is just one step, and what happens downstream from that is as critical as the bioprinting step itself. So you can see here are examples of cell aggregates that fuse together to become one. And so tissue fusion is one important principle, and another important principle is the sorting out of cells. The cells themselves know how to migrate to where they should be. And an example of this is a blood vessel. So what would come out of a bioprinter is a bioprinter would print layer by layer a blood vessel, and perhaps a good representation of that is what's in the upper right-hand corner there. That's what the surrounding material, the stuff in pink, would be the hydrogel, and then the stuff in red and the stuff in green would be the cellular material itself, and then the lumen, the inside of the blood vessel, would be, again, more hydrogel. And then what happens is that you can then take this blood vessel off the printer and put it into a bioreactor where you then keep feeding your cells, so you introduce it to you have nutrient pulsing through it. And then something very strange happens. Under the right conditions, while you've made this, your cell aggregates may involve anything from 2 to 3 different types of cells. The types of cells, and they can be completely mixed, the type of cells that typically line the inside of the blood vessel are called endothelial cells. And they recognize flow. They recognize that flow is happening, and they're going to automatically migrate to the inside of the blood vessel. That's just what cells do. That's a natural process. And the fibroblast cells, which typically would be on the outside of the blood vessel, they want to move as far away from the flow as possible. So they move to the outside of the blood vessel. And that's an automatic process that takes place. It's the cells sort themselves out automatically. And as a result, bioprinting does not need to place cells exactly where they ultimately should be. It just needs to create the right protostructure that can then mature on its own. Now, what's great about bioprinting and then these post-printing conditioning processes is that you can create great geometrical complexity. So you can create things like sheets, you can create things like branching vasculature, branching structures, you can create blood vessels, and Organovo, indeed, last fall has announced that they have a liver tissue construct that is now available on the market, that are used by pharmaceutical companies to test and develop new drugs, to test for liver toxicity in new drugs. And they're also working on other tissues like kidney, skin, etc. So, as this technology was developing, people kept on approaching us with some crazy ideas. And they'd say, hey, if you can make muscle using bioprinting, what about making meat? Or if you can make skin using bioprinting, what about making leather? And we thought of ourselves as a medical company. We were very much focused on pharmaceutical partners, so we were very dismissive of those ideas. But, and I thought those ideas, frankly, were very crazy. But sometime later, I was living in China. I was on the board of Organovo, and I was working as a venture investor, and I was living in China, attending to some investments there. And I saw firsthand that the amount of meat being consumed in Shanghai was going up visibly. And meat prices were very high, and the quality was not very good. And if you wanted to go, let's say, to a steak restaurant on a night out in Shanghai, chances are that your steak would be flown in from Latin America or from Australia. And that seemed crazy to me. And prices were going up, and I thought to myself, gosh, if everybody in China starts consuming the way that we do in the United States or in Europe, we're going to have an environmental catastrophe on our hands. So maybe this idea of looking to think of another way of making animal products for consumer applications is not crazy after all. And that's what gave rise to my next venture, Modern Meadow. So the driving idea behind Modern Meadow is how to make animal products better without killing animals and without having the same impact on the environment. And the thesis behind this is a very simple one. I think you guys are all going to understand it very easily. A lot of people on the planet. Currently, there's about 60 billion land animals that we rely on each year for our milk, dairy, eggs, and leather goods. So as the population grows, and as the world becomes wealthier, there's a growing global middle class, there's going to be a near doubling of the demand for animal products in the course of the next couple of decades. So how do you satisfy that near doubling of demand when already today the livestock industry is the largest user of land, directly and indirectly? It's the leading user of fresh water globally, and it is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally. And by many estimates, actually, 18% is a conservative figure. Some would argue that it's as high as 51%. Some argue that it's 14%. However you look at it, it's a large number, and it's the most significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The problem with these numbers is you can't double them. So if there's a doubling of demand for animal products in the next couple of decades, these numbers we can't double without moving to a different planet. And many would argue that we're already beyond the carrying capacity of this planet. So how do we balance this equation? Well, one of the things we can look at, one of the analogies we can look at is energy. Energy is another one of those fields where there's been a huge amount of demand growth in the last 50 years, and projected demand growth. And the energy industry realized early on that the key to satisfying this growing demand is to think about the supply of energy as a portfolio, and that you need diversity, and that diversity is going to also provide resilience under different economic conditions and different environmental conditions. So 50 years ago, most of our energy came from non-renewable sources, fossil fuels. And there's been a significant demand since, but that demand has largely been met by nuclear and renewable sources. So it's not to say that fossil fuels in the aggregate are less consumed today than they were 50 years ago. But the growth in demand has not been met by fossil fuels, it's been met by these alternatives. So the question is, what's going to happen on animal protein? Right now, most of our animal protein is met by factory farming, intensive factory farming, and that's very environmentally burdensome. And yeah, there's some organic farming, but actually some would argue that that's actually more environmentally taxing. It just makes us feel good, but on a resource basis, it's actually more environmentally more environmentally intensive. And then there's some alternatives. But the question is, what's going to be the portfolio that satisfies our demand in the next few decades? So really, there's three basic things we can do, and these are instructive because these are things that happen in the energy industry as well. One, manage demand. So just consume less. Meatless Mondays, that's great, they should be more broadly adopted. And there's also been a growth in vegetarianism, veganism, flexitarianism, just less consumption of meat. That's an easy thing to do. But all the gains that are being done on that front are more than offset by the growth in consumption in emerging markets. And also, behavioral change is a hard thing to achieve on a global scale. So meat just tastes good. And I, of all people, know the bad effects of eating meat on your health and on the environment, and I'm not a vegetarian. I still eat meat. I love the taste of a hamburger. So if I'm even aware of that, and I can't modify my behavior to completely eliminate meat, it must be hard for, I think, a lot of other people to do that as well. So that's part of the solution. We can certainly cultivate more sustainably or mitigate some of the waste from the way that we farm. And there's a lot of innovation happening in the distribution models. So there's new farm-to-table models. There's a lot of people looking at how to minimize waste in the agricultural fields, minimize waste in the supermarkets, minimize waste in restaurants, minimize waste in your home. So there's a whole bunch of waste at all levels of the supply chain. And certainly there's a lot that could be done there. But those improvements are going to be incremental. And if you think about it, the way that an animal, the way that a cow is raised today is fundamentally the same than it was 50 years ago. So we can't necessarily expect a revolutionary change on that front. But a lot of incremental changes are good, but it's unlikely that there's going to be a huge disruptive change on that front. But nonetheless, that's part of the equation as well. And then we need supply-side solutions as well. So we need both plant-based alternatives as well as animal protein-based alternatives, and that's where we reside. Actually, one of the fastest growing aisles in the supermarket is this aisle. It's the meat alternative aisle. And if you would have gone into a supermarket 10 years ago, there would have been a few products, and now you go in, it's full of choices. So there's a growing set of alternatives, and the alternatives are becoming more and more and more biomimetic. So there's more approaches that are actually looking to recreate the mouthfeel and the flavor of real meat, and I think that's a good set of innovations. For us as a company, we've decided that we want to go a different way. Our goal is not to create a better tofurkey. Our goal is to create something different. But nonetheless, I think this is encouraging. So our insight is that you can actually create animal products from the cells themselves. And that allows you to minimize waste. So why raise the entire animal when you can just create the products you want from cells? And this is actually not a very new idea. This idea has been written about and talked about for almost 100 years, as old as the idea of cell culture itself. So Churchill famously wrote in the 1930s, if you think about it, traditional animal farming is an absurdity. There should be a more efficient way to do this by creating the products we need from cell culture, by growing cells in their own suitable medium. And actually, Churchill's not the first one to think, what? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, gosh, we've got a lot more to cover. So Churchill is not the first one to think about this either, because the idea of culturing our food is thousands of years old. All the best stuff out there, beer, wine, cheese, yogurt, coffee, chocolate, is the product of fermentation or cell culture. So this idea is not really a new one. So this was our initial idea, which is why don't we take some of the things that we've learned from Organovo about biofabrication and apply that to making meat. And we take cells from an animal, we grow them. It's natural cells from a natural animal. The animal doesn't need to be harmed, so it can be taken from a biopsy. Grow them in cell culture, use bioprinting or biofabrication techniques to create muscle units, and then grind them up and create all kinds of delicious meat products. This is an early idea, and our idea has evolved significantly since then. The environmental impacts are significant. I'm going to skip through this, but rest assured, there's been some study on the life cycle effect of doing this. There's been early cooking demonstrations. So 4 years ago, my father tasted a pork chop that didn't involve killing a pig at TED-Med, and he's still alive and well. And Mark Post, a year and a half ago, unveiled a hamburger in London. He's a Dutch scientist, and that was well covered by the media. So there's been great progress in this field. Now, what we've learned is that this is, if you develop great new technology, and the best you can do is come up with a simulacrum, or the I can't believe it's not a slaughtered hamburger, it's a failure of the imagination. Tofurkey is not what we should aspire to do here. What we're developing is fundamentally a new ingredient, and there's a product out there that's the best expression of that new ingredient. So we're working with high-end chefs right now to develop those products. And I'm just going to digress to say we're actually focused on commercializing materials first. So we're developing leather. Leather's the product that's going to hit the market first for us, and the reason why is because we believe that in developing new technology, it's easier to accept it in a wearable form than in an edible form. And we have a lot of eager partners who want to work with us on this. We actually are very impressed by how eager people are to try the food as well, but we want to be patient about that and very conversational about that, so people are not caught off guard. The way we make leather, I'm going to skip it for now. So this is the illustration of the idea that you don't need to be biomimetic. If you're developing a new product, a new way of doing things, be true to that new ingredient and come up with a product that's the best expression of that new ingredient. So here's an illustration. We're not committed to this as the final product, but it's an example. We developed a product called steak chips. And steak chips was a whimsical, fun product that's a beef jerky that's crunchy, and it looks like a potato chip. And it's made entirely without killing an animal. And no harm to animals or the environment. Nutritionally, it's 70% protein, very little fat. Delicious. High quality ingredients, everything, the cells are natural and the ingredients it's grown in are natural. And the production process is very transparent. In fact, the way it's made is you take cells from an animal, you grow it in a soup of nutrients, you add a little bit of pectin, which is the sugar that congeals jam from apples and citrus, and then we add some spices to it, so barbecue flavor or teriyaki flavor, and then we bake it in a food dehydrator to create crunchy chips. And we had tastings of it last year. We first unveiled it at Google's Solve4X. Sergey Brin was the first to taste it. And we've had a bunch of other people taste it since, Peter Thiel, Peter Diamandis, and about 200 other people. And the feedback has been very positive. That's what it looks like over there. Now, we're not yet committed to this as a product because remember, we're focused on materials, and that's what we're going to commercialize first. And now we're working with chefs to explore all the form factors that our ingredients can support. So again, our vision for the future is that rather than meat being produced far away from people and being processed in slaughterhouses that people wouldn't want you to see what happens in there, it can actually be a very transparent process, and it can be more like a brewery. So that's why we're in Brooklyn. We really want to embrace that idea of the brewery being the future of meat. And yeah, so I'm happy to be open to Q&A. I'm just going to leave this up here. No time for Q&A?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have much time for Q&A because we have the time on this, but you can be around until after this?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I know you did a TED Talk. I TED you did this in 10 minutes. And you have a million views. This was fantastic. Yes. So basically, if I understood correctly, you're basically saving humanity, right?
What is it?
You're basically saving humanity. That's your vision.
We're one. I mean, no. We're definitely motivated by the environmental impact, and we're motivated by creating better products. But it's going to take a lot of different efforts to do that. So we're one part of many solutions, hopefully.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.